welcome to my channel. I read my father's manuscripts, and basically what I'm doing right now is I'm reading a fantasy adventure called Stonecaller. Oh my goodness. And tonight I am reading chapter 6. So without further ado, here is chapter 6. The road wound up into the hills. An early morning rain had laid the dust, presaging the coming fall and winter rains. This allowed a fair view of the army slogging along behind, until the tail of the force disappeared behind the shoulder of a hill. He was important now, Quedram mused, which meant that he rode up near the front, not at the back tail end. Not that he rode well, but he could manage to stay on a horse. Most of the time. He'd had enough experience for that. It was going to take much more experience before his backside became accustomed to it. They'd already shed most of the army, part of it doomed to the doomed garrison of Lakvosta. How did those men accept their fate? He thought to himself, and more dismissed to their homes. What remained was a small, solid core. He was near the front, yet not at the front, so he is still some distance from the Lady Anadristi, which was just as well. He didn't belong up there with the lords looking down their noses at him. He didn't lack for company. Several of the lesser lords were interested in him, and for some that interest went beyond what would be shown for a strange animal. Casabano also rode with Quedram. The skirt of his robe hiked up to allow him to sit on a horse, revealing a pair of hairy, brawny legs matching the rest of him. Their talk was not the sort of serious talk they had in the wine shop, but much less serious. Casabano was interested in many things, trees and plants native to Quedram's homeland, and even the old stories they told there. This last reminded Quedram of that evening of storytelling with Shapakalish. Up into the hills they wound, day by day. The weather was cooler now, decidedly on the edge of autumn. The showers that soaked them from time to time were now cold, chilling to the bone. The only good fortune, muttered one of the lesser lords, is that there's no pursuit. In fact, a messenger on a worn horse had come to tell them Lakvosta had fallen again, but that Lasabalston appeared to have no intention of advancing beyond there. The reports said that upward of 300 people of the city had been marched away to the lowlands in chains. Rumor also said that the lady had declared, "We will free them when we return." Quedram could well imagine her saying something of the sort. He also felt he recognized a statement that was expected, though the speaker had no way of knowing whether it could be carried out. This not being his country, Quedram had no idea where they were headed. Even the name of their goal, the wooded Badaba, was nothing more than a name. Many others were in the same case, as witness the rumors. It was over the next hill. It was 3 days away. It was another week's march, and so on, and so on. Quedram decided they'd be there when they got there and stopped fussing about it. Along the way, he practiced with his stones. Yes, there was the problem of people thinking he was showing off, but on the other hand, he needed to find out just what he could do and learn to better it. Casabano approached him in the evening. "You know, men are a bit leery riding near you when you have stones flying around you. It seems a bit risky." Quedram looked at the wizard. "It doesn't bother you?" Casabano laughed. "I'm a wizard, remember? I'm fairly sure none of your stones would hit me by accident. Others aren't quite so sure." After that, he settled for stacking the stones on the saddle in front of him in various patterns, such as diamonds, circles, or inverted triangles. It was all practice. Then they entered a dark wood, mostly thick stands of willow, but not seeming much different from any of the other several woods they'd marched through. Word came back that this was the wooded Badaba, though no one, not even Casabano, seem to have any idea of what a badaba was. Here they set up a camp, which they then set about turning into a permanent camp. Fatigue parties set to work building quarters for the Carmista and a selection of lords. Other parties set to work building shelters for the army itself. Building material consisted of wood and sod and stone. The Lady Anavristi expressed her thanks for the work that the men had done on her behalf. Lord Gwathnarin, who had had no compunction about going to work with the lifting and hauling, as well as directing the camp's layout and the work in general, grinned through his grime and sweat and responded, "Least we could do, lady." Quadrum and 2 minor lords, Malsanto and Genelabus, had put together their own shelter. Quadrum, a little more knowledgeable of what they needed, oversaw the matter, making sure that the north and east walls were as windproof as could be. After that came the problem of food. They had brought considerable grain with them, picking up a few bushels here and there along the line of the march. While the building was going on, Gwathnarin set parties out to find any farms in the area and gather some grain in the Carmista's name. Quadrum had heard the orders were, "Don't take everything. We need these people to be at least willing to put up with us. If we grab their last bushel, they'll likely head off somewhere else, and if we're here next year, what have we got? So, be careful." Furthermore, parties of men familiar with the hills went out looking for any edible roots. It was late in the year for any berries anyone knew of. Some people, who knew the good from the bad, were set to collecting mushrooms. Quadrum went with the hunting parties, using his sling and stones to take down deer. Deer hunting was something an ordinary slinger wouldn't try, but Quadrum was no ordinary slinger. In addition, he was able to knock down the more common game for slingers, rabbits, quail, and the like. Then the fine cold rains of winter settled in, and men were kept busy plugging leaks in roofs and walls. It wasn't the kind of living Quadrum liked, but he tried to make himself feel content with the knowledge that no one else among the army was having it any better. They had gotten themselves well settled into their encampment, when one evening Casabano came to the door of the shelter, which Quadrum shared with Malsanto and Genelabus. "Quadrum, I need to speak with you. I need to talk to you." "Here I am." Quadrum was... Casabano stepped closer to Quadrum and spoke quietly. "The ladies and some others are making a trip to talk to the king of Davlash. I want you along." "Me? Talk to kings? Doesn't sound likely." Casabano's teeth showed in the gloom as he grinned. "And you're not likely to talk to the king. But I've spent a long time thinking it over, and even looking into omens. Chancy things that they are, and I think we'll be better off if you come." "Omens? What kind of omens have you been consulting? The ones at the bottom of a wine jar?" Casabano only continued to smile good-naturedly. "No, omens were the least of it. All they told me was, Quadrum may be a help. I've spent a bit of time with Gwathnarin and the lady, telling them that if we're going to King Balsadin as supplicants, it might be best that we have some proof that we have some possibility of winning. Your powers, even though they may not be fully developed, are one thing in our favor. Particularly as Balsadin himself is new and his position is slightly unsure." He paused. "Previously there was a blood relationship, no matter how tenuous, between the lady and the king of Davlash. Now, however, they are calling on aid in the time of the relationship that had existed, a tie which, set against the needs and political necessities of the kings, is so tenuous as to be invisible. So you see, the least little thing that might favor us must be considered. Even disreputable slingers." The smile removed any sting in that epithet. "Like that, is it? All right, I'll come. I suppose you'll tell me what I have to do to help, and when. If I know myself. Just have yourself ready to set out tomorrow." So, he was ready. The day began in the cloud and mizzling rain, making for a miserable cold day if we were to spend outside on the trail. Is this the omen of how the weather for our trip will be? He grudged to Casabano. Casabano chuckled. Weather predictions are not my specialty, but it is winter, you know. Would it surprise you to know that the weather for the trip isn't likely to be much different than this? Huh, you could lie a bit just to make me happy. The Third Wizard laughed. Humor was hard to come by on the trip. The trail was narrow and often slippery, so slippery that on some slopes the horses must be led. The wet eventually soaked through all garments, and so they were never warm. Their route took them deeper into the hills at first, as a precaution to allow them to slip around any towns that Batlas might have garrisoned. After 2 days, they reached a cross trail, which, for all Quedrum could see, was no different from the one they were on. But they turned to take the right fork. It took them deeper into the hills as well, then tended off leftward, and eventually they began to come out of the hills. The weather, aside from a few breaks in the rain, did not change. The trail was still bad, and by now every stream and river was in spate. Fording streams was hard, fording rivers was treacherous, and twice they lost men to the raging waters. One was swept away when his horse stepped into a hole, and another was caught by a tree swept down from higher up, which hit him and his horse like a battering ram. Still, they went on. One evening they came upon Shapakalish, camped for the evening, with his mule close by. Gwathnaran and the men making up Anniversary's guard were suspicious. A suspicious nature was a prized trait in a bodyguard. Quedrum stayed away from Shapakalish, and acted as though he didn't know the little man. However, the little man refused to play his part properly. He did act as though he and Quedrum had never met, but that was all. After a long discussion, the display of the contents of his mule's packs, Gwathnaran and the guards were satisfied that he was probably harmless. Despite that, they did not let him near the lady. After a while, Shapakalish casually dropped by the fire where Quedrum was sitting alone. "Ah, my young fellow, I believe I might have something to interest you." "I doubt it." "Ah, but I have." The merchant's voice lowered. "I'm going to talk to you in the guise of selling you a fire lighting talisman, guaranteed to light a fire on even the wettest wood. And we have to discuss the matter for so very long because you must bargain me down from an exceedingly excessive 20 silvers to 5. Now I have a hint for you, one which may be of use in the days to come. It is this: consider what a king might be thinking about anything." Consider what a king might be? What kind of more Korean gibberish is this? If you have some advice, tell me straight out. If I tell you straight out everything I believe you need to know, we'll be sitting here all night and your companions will be rightly suspicious. And this is not some obscure hint. You and your party are going to ask a favor of a king. Think about what the king is going to want, what he knows, what he fears. Use your head a bit, and you'll be the better for it. This sounds like the kind of advice you should give to the lady, or Lord Gwathnaran. "Oh, caller of stones, how much heed will they give me? You at least are acquainted with me." "All right, then I'll do it." "Fine, now give me my 5 silvers. "Give you?" "We were bargaining, remember? If you give me no money, everyone watching will know you were lying about buying anything from me. That would not be good for either of us." Quedrum dug into his pouch, brought up 5 silver pieces, and passed them over. "And here is your talisman, and a good night to you." He left them the next morning, heading off in another direction. Quedrum wondered if Shapakalish knew more about what faced him than he said, and wished he'd stayed around a little longer so Quedrum might get more out of him. The great city of Gatuios was surrounded by stone walls. It was, Quedrin reflected, probably a great city in this region, but it wasn't all that huge. After all, he'd seen Saragos. He knew, though, that mocking his fellow travelers, what his travelers considered a great city, would win him no friends. Would win him no friends among them. So he rode through the winding, zigzag streets, admiring them with the sanctuary and the fine buildings. Some larger buildings had marble facades, making it seem as though the whole building were built of marble. Some buildings, however, had places where square sheets of marble had fallen away to reveal the rugged stonework beneath, which ruined the effect. A boy had gone running ahead of the ladies' party from the gate where they had entered, so there were servants waiting at the main door of the palace to greet them. "Greetings, lady," said one of them, a tall man, now slightly stooped, leaning on his staff. "In the king's name, greetings. We will direct you to your quarters, and the king will summon you at an appropriate time." All of which, Quedrin felt, was a polite way of saying the king would call for them sometime or other. Most likely the king didn't even know where they were there yet. That they were there yet. The servants showed them to a suite of rooms in the palace, the walls which were stone, worked vaguely into square shapes, and put together with a minimum of mortar. Woven hangings, usually portraying historical scenes, covered much of this expanse of stone. Quedrin recognized one of the few scenes. One exception to this was an excessively stylized version of Thotgor Peacemaker's Great Victory. Even that seemed a little unusual to Quedrin, that Thotgor and his commanders had been portrayed wearing high tiaras, something he'd never heard of before. Nor were the tiaras the kind of thing you'd wear into battle. But you're not here to decide whether there are faults in the palace hangings, he thought to himself. The party washed up, changed clothes, warmed themselves at charcoal braziers, and waited. No one expected the king to see them immediately. Even supposing that he really wanted to talk to them, doing so too soon might give the wrong impression, that he was at the disposal of a mere carmista. However, servants supplied them with good and plentiful food, as well as new clothing, which was a sign that the king was, at least, not ill-disposed to them. King Falsadan of Daivalash was a strong-looking, handsome man. He wore fawn-colored tunic and trousers with a light scale-mail cuirass over top. Of course, Quedrin thought. He's just managed to take the throne in the face of the other claimants. Armor would be a necessary safeguard. He continued to look at the sovereign. This was the man whose mind he was supposed to read, or something. Well, what would a king think? It came to him, not as a magical reading of the king's thoughts, but a flash of insight into the situation. This was a new king who had taken the throne in a contested succession. He was still shoring up his support, rewarding supporters, giving gifts carefully to those who might offer him something, if only a promise of no trouble. This was not a good time to come to him for the kind of help the lady needed. It had to be tried, at the very least. They had to be sure that no help would be forthcoming to King Falsadan. The king spoke. "Welcome, Lady Anavristi, Carvista of Higfrid. This is a cheerless weather to travel in. I trust your quarters are dry and warm." Even for kings, basic courtesy must be maintained. A sovereign did not greet anyone simply by demanding, "What do you want?" In fact, a sovereign usually had some well-informed advisors to suggest to him just as what any supplicant wanted. So, Anavristi, being courteous in turn, said, "Thank you for your hospitality, King Falsadan. You have been so very generous to us, and I thank you in the name of the ancient bond between my house and yours." This last, of course, overstated the case. He was only tenuously, if at all, related to the kings who had been related to her by blood, but it might be taken as a hint that she had hoped he would accept for himself the bond that those who had previously held had acknowledged in their time. I do what I am able, said the king. He paused. Tell me, what is this news I hear from your land of Batlas and his incursion? It has been a tragic business, Highness. After making demands no person could accept, he resorted to war. We met him on the field of battle, and at the end of a day's fighting, though we held the field, we felt it best to withdraw. We have withdrawn to the hills and are making preparations to return. Ah, the battle! I have heard of it, though what I've heard has been distorted by being transferred from mouth to mouth, as it were. Tell me, how did it go? Quidrum half expected Anniversary to call on Gwathmeren to speak to this, but she did not. Clearly and concisely, with little elaboration, she described the main movements and the result of each. When she was done, the king was silent for a bit. I would know more of these invulnerable soldiers, he said finally. What can you tell me of them? They are produced by magic, a sort of thinking person would call foul. It seems they are a sort of pottery, bound together and animated by spells, so that they are almost invulnerable. From what we have heard, Batlas has some 500 of them. We have a wizard with us who can tell you more about them. Ah, the Thard wizard among you. His voice spoke of wariness. Kings and rulers were usually very wary of Thard wizards, having heard tales, often outrageously expanded tales, of their works. And what can you tell us, wizard? Casabanho spoke, as though he hadn't noticed the coolness of the king's tone. These men are made by mixing freshly shed human blood with clay and molding it into shapes of men, with spells being used at all points in the manufacture. I'm of the opinion that Batlas is being deliberately careless with their manufacture so as to produce a larger number than usual, believing the invulnerability of an unknown number of them incomplete. This is intended to lead others to underestimate them, to find themselves suddenly facing a corps of perhaps 1,000 who cannot be killed. I see, said the king slowly. Are they truly invulnerable as it seems? Nearly so, Highness. You understand, I have no first-hand knowledge of the making of such. Only an understanding of their power. It would seem to me, from what I know, that it costs at least 100 of them could withstand several, perhaps even a score, of hard blows before invulnerability was overcome. And with 1,000 such, perhaps more, you could say, a man could sweep the battlefield with them if he used them well. The king was thoughtful. By now, Quidrum had realized something more. The king was not likely to put himself in the position of offering support to an enemy of Batlas. If Batlas, with his pottery warriors, should take great offense to this, he might extend his war to encompass the overthrow of the king. So, Lady Anavristi, what would you desire of me? Highness, I ask that you give me aid to drive Batlas from my land. King Felsidon nodded. He would have foreseen that as the least of Anavristi's likely requests. I must discuss this with my counselors. If you will accept my hospitality for a time, I will call you again to tell you my decision. I thank you for hearing me, Highness. She would not have expected an immediate response, Quidrum realized. Indeed, she would have been greatly surprised if such a response were forthcoming. Be free of my palace, lady. Be free of my city. I would only ask that, if you go out into the city, you do so in company of a party of my guards. My city is quite safe, but it is not impossible that your enemies, or my enemies, might have found their way inside. You are a very gracious and generous Highness. It was 3 days more before the king recalled them. Quidrum listened carefully, found out that most of the others, especially the Lady Anavristi and Lord Gwathmeren, had reached the same conclusion he had. There would be little help to come from this quarter. The king was smiling as he greeted them. After all the courtesies were done, the questions as to their quarters and rations asked and answered with the polite phrases, the king spoke to the question. With regard to your request, lady, I have prepared a letter to be sent to Batlas of Dora, stating my disapproval over his actions. A copy shall be provided for you. The lady did not let her face betray the depth of her disappointment. She did say, though, against all tradition of polite and indirect speech, I thank you, Highness. I had hoped for something more tangible. The king's expression did not flicker at this impoliteness. I do have another small token here. He snapped his fingers, and a servant stepped forth, carrying a small chest, a little less than a forearm arm in length, half that wide, and a palm breadth in depth. The servant brought it to the lady, then opened the lid to reveal a mass of gold coins. One of Lady's servants stepped forward to take charge of the chest. You may be my guest, lady, until the weather improves sufficiently enough to travel. Your Highness is very generous, but I must return to my people. No, I must insist you stay. It is altogether too dangerous on the roads at this season. Quedram read a little more into this situation. The king would, indeed, send his letter of protest, with one excuse or another. He would keep the lady here as a guest, letting Batlas secure his hold on Higfrid. The king clearly hoped that this would keep Batlas from reaching out for the crown, at least until such time as someone discovered a solution to the problem of the pottery soldiers. The lady bowed, though. I thank you for your concern over our welfare, Highness. There were more guards to escort them back to their assigned quarters, just so we don't go rejecting his hospitality. The door to their suite of rooms was not locked, but a pair of guards took their places outside the doors. Okay, thank you so much and have a good night. For really real. Take care.